Welcome to EHO Knows. My favourite genre of movie is a zombie movie. Just that concept of just having civilization suddenly just stop and what happens afterwards. And we today are interviewing someone who effectively worked in a zombie city, in that instantly everyone just got up, walked out of the city, and it just closed down. And from an environmental health point of view, could you imagine just the risks involved with that? So we're talking about no cleanup. We're talking about just literally standing up and walking away. And so my guest today, Stephen Stout, his job was to come in weeks later to try and stop a health disaster and also ready the city once again, no idea when, for people to return again. So Stephen, welcome to EHO Knows.
Nice to be here.
Now, the zombie city that we're talking about is
Christchurch City and the earthquake in 2010, 2011.
Yeah. And everyone in Australia is well and truly aware of the earthquake. But what happened was we basically had a bad earthquake, but then afterwards, how much longer after the first earthquake did the second one happen?
It was 4 months. Yeah, about 4 months. It's February. February, first one was in November, February. I've honestly forgotten the dates. All I know is that we had just moved into our brand new building in August, and we'd been in for 6 weeks. We got kicked out for the first earthquake, got back in, and got kicked out by the second one. So yeah, February 11th is the second one. So there was a good few weeks in between.
And part of the story is the difference in psychology between, after the first earthquake versus after the second earthquake. I got the impression that after the first earthquake, there was this hope of rebuilding and quickly getting back together. The psychology changed totally on the second earthquake. So let's start on the day of the second earthquake. What was it like? What happened in Christchurch during the second earthquake?
Well, interestingly enough, I was actually at a meeting of EHOs outside of the city at one of our neighbouring councils. And from that perspective, which is only 25k away, it was like a fairly solid but aftershock, really. You know, the big earthquake was 7.3. The aftershock, the February one, was only 5.4, but very shallow. So where we were, it was very much that's a really big aftershock. And we didn't really think too much more about it until it started to come over the news about all the damage that happened in Christchurch. My wife, who is also an EHO, was actually in the city at that time. It was around lunchtime. She was actually at her gym, and she was within 100 meters of the CTV building when it collapsed and saw it go down.
Wow, yes. The level of devastation. So when you talk about, the CTV building, what was that like?
You can go back and look at the news footage of it. Basically, it just pancaked straight down. So it was a great big pile of rubble. My wife she said she saw it go down, and she actually went and helped remove people and ended up in the triage centre in a nearby park. And she helped out as long as she felt she could before she stayed with one of the people that was taken out of the building at the triage centre and just basically was there to support them. But that triage centre, it was getting people from CTV building, but also all over the city, because you had the things that people don't necessarily think of initially, which is that buildings don't necessarily collapse completely, but bits of them fall off. And so there were a lot of people who were injured by things falling off of buildings. Not necessarily that the whole building collapsed, but loose parapets and things like that fell and hit people. So there was lots of rubble. Walls collapsed in various places. There was a bus that was crushed by a building that fell off basically a front wall fell off of the building. So you have lots of stuff moving around and coming down.
And so you've got people in buildings who are now fleeing buildings and in fact stepping out onto the street where you've now got falling glass, falling rubble.
Yep.
And then you just had a mass foot exodus of people walking out of the city.
Yep. So people walked out. We were actually coming, as I say, we were actually coming the other way. So there was piles and piles of traffic going against us. We were one of the few vehicles going into the city. And we got so far as one of my then colleagues' houses, and I walked home from there, which was about 4 kilometers. And basically it was to check up on my house. The first earthquake had not done very much to us at all. The second one, different direction and different energies involved. And so it totaled a few more things. Didn't do a major amount of damage to our house, but cupboards and things on shelves and everything, where the first earthquake hadn't done very much to that, the second one, totaled a lot of it.
Yes.
So we had a lot of broken damage inside.
So what did your life then look like for the next couple of days?
After the second earthquake, basically first couple of days was us tidying up in the house. We were actually, because our house was substantially complete, both of us actually put up our hands and said, look, we can come in, we can get to wherever you need us to be. And that was basically the civil defense centers and things like that. So that within the next couple of days, it was, to be brutally honest, once you had started to tidy up your stuff at home, in our situation anyway, it was, well, what do we do? Life isn't normal, but we have things that we can do that the community may need us to do. So we were quite quickly back into work. And it was a really good distraction from otherwise, we're just sitting around home. We didn't have broken doors or windows, so the house was secure and things like that. So we could leave comfortable in that we didn't have to stay and look after anything.
We are not focusing on this, but what were the environmental health issues in the couple of weeks afterwards?
But the couple of weeks afterwards, we were really environmental health officers tend to be the masters of nothing, but know everyone. So we were cycling out of the response center. So we weren't there all day. At least in the beginning, everyone wasn't there all day. And so you would do a couple of hours on a stint. You were with what in Australia would be the federal health people and our local medical officer of health. And we were at a desk answering inquiries and things. Usually the sort of thing, council call centers and everyone else would punch through things that no one knew what to do with. This doesn't sound like a road issue or a water issue or a something else issue. So it must be environmental health. And we would get hold of it and we would sort out what it was, who it should go to. And because we pretty much work with everyone, we could put that in place and say, right, well, this has to go to this guy. Because the center was really everyone on top of everyone else, it meant that you could just basically walk about 10 meters and find someone and talk to them, resolve the issue and get something underway. So it was really tight that way. It was really just responding to quite a lot of interesting little issues. What do we do with this? What do we do with our rubbish? Is our rubbish collection still happening? And it would be, well, we'll have to talk to that council collection service about that. I've heard it happen somewhere else, but not. So it was basically sorting through and piling through a lot of those things. And as time went on, we picked up more and more of the general same issues, but more focused on particular things. So it might be, is our water supply in this area safe now or not? Now, we'd kick those across to the water people, but at the same time, we would want to find out for ourselves because the next time someone asks.
Yeah. Because, the scale of things, you had sewage, pipes just lifted above ground, but drinking water, pipes just broken, lack of access to water, and then road access. So it is an interesting one in terms of garbage collection. Were the tips
Yeah.
still available? Were they still taking stuff? How do you get trucks in and out? And so virtually every aspect of public safety was just up for grabs. The classic, what was the term for flushing the toilet and having a negative experience?
There wasn't really a term. What we found, and this sort of went through the whole place, it was known that the liquefaction in particular had floated pipes. So sewers were questionable all over the city. Most people tended to work on the, if I use the toilet and flush, I've got water and it goes away. Therefore, all is good.
Yes.
The issues that came with that were, if it was broken downstream, eventually your pipe would fill up and there would be it doesn't flush and doesn't go away. And then we would get a call saying, hey, what's happened to the sewer on our area? And we'd be off tracking down what we can do. One of the quickest responses to the whole thing, and knowing that the sewers had broken, I think Christchurch managed to acquire every single portaloo in the South Island, and I think they were even coming down from the North Island. So you ended up putting, until the sewer systems were able to be assessed, you put portaloos for about every 2 or 3 houses down the street. So it was like an outdoor loo on the street. So every street would get so many portaloos, one for so many houses, just so that people had a secure, known toilet spot, you could say.
So if Doctor Who was a Kiwi, he'd be moving around in a portaloo because no one would notice a portaloo just suddenly appearing or disappearing.
Yep, and people stole them.
Okay.
One of the complaints we dealt with regularly was that a street was supposed to have so many portaloos on it, and now it only had one. And you'd be, wonder where they went. And probably you found out within 4 or 5 days, because you'd get someone else calling saying, no one's come to service the portaloo and it's full up. And it was, well, where are you? And you'd find that people, particularly they always said, older family members or lots of kids or something else, or perceived safety, would go down to the street, basically take the portaloo back up their driveway and put it in their backyard. So you couldn't see them from the street and you didn't know where they'd gone. And when they started to complain that it wasn't being emptied, then you would know where they were.
Were they still in the backyard?
Yeah.
So you get a complaint from someone go, the portaloo that I stole hasn't been emptied. Why aren't you guys doing your job?
Yep.
Okay.
So, yeah, and then you had to have conversations with them. There was a scheme in place that if you did have people who were relatively immobile or wouldn't be able to make it down, or in some parts of the city, there were issues to get to a safe place on the street just from liquefaction and dirt and silt and all the rest of it, you could get a portaloo just for that family. But it was very much on a, look, you've got limited mobility people who can't get down to the street, or for some reason you can't. So they were given one of their own, and we kept a track of those. And then, not quite sure how long afterwards, I've still got ours, the civil defence people cornered the market on like the cassette camping toilets that you put like in a camper van or you take in a tent.
Yes.
And I'm not sure if every household in Christchurch got one, but lots of people got one of those delivered, so that
wow,
if your sewer wasn't working, that was how you could go.
It's interesting in terms of a humanitarian effort. Yeah, if you've got nowhere to go, suddenly to be bringing in thousands, 100,000 of these loot.
In a cardboard box with a package of chemicals and the instructions on how to use it. I mean, immediately after the earthquake, there was lots of information on how to dig and prepare a long drop safely, and Facebook and things like that were full of people's ideas with commode chairs and rubbish bags and kitty litter filled rubbish bags, because it all worked. You know, if you were in an apartment or had no backyard and you couldn't dig a long drop, then what do I do? And so there was lots of quite reasonable answers that came up, and we got asked lots of them, is this okay to do? Is this okay to do? And it was like, well, you've got everything contained. We can dispose of it through the rubbish collections. It's not causing a health problem. We don't have an issue with that. Some of the long drops probably created a problem because some of the aquifers are quite close and some people were quite diggy.
Yes.
So, yeah.
So after the earthquake, like months afterwards, Christchurch was notorious for having the most shipping containers in the world all there. Before the shipping containers, there were portaloos. And so you probably did well to be known for, the city with the most shipping containers rather than the most portaloos in the world. Okay, so you then have people doing do-it-yourself toilets and all that sort of stuff to cope just with the days afterwards. What about water, drinking water?
Drinking water, Fonterra, which is a big dairy company, was really quick. Those areas where there wasn't any pipe supply available, they brought water tankers in, placed them in, you had fresh water stations so everyone could go and collect water. And those pretty much appeared anywhere where they were needed, where there wasn't an adequate running water supply. There was a boil notice water on for the whole city because we had no idea the integrity of the water supply. So if you couldn't get water from one of these, if you could get water from a tanker, it was potable, fresh, you didn't need to boil it. Where if your tap was running, we were running the boil water notice because we don't know how reliable it is. So Fonterra was really good. There was lots of water available. The Army, Navy crews brought in their big bladders and pumped them full of water and provided that as well. So as far as getting water to people, it went surprisingly quickly. You always get some place that would end up with, but we can't get water. The Navy, I think, was running power and desalination off one of the ships in Littleton Harbour. So we were finding answers for everything fairly quickly that seemed to work pretty well. Downsides of that, particularly for the Fonterra crew, was they set these water stations up and all of their trucks and everything are set up to be sanitized, and all the connections are brass so they can be sanitized and clean and durable.
Yes.
And we had to basically source plastic ones once those started to be stolen.
Seriously?
Yep. Well, scrap metal. They're big, heavy brass fittings, and they started to disappear. And once they started to disappear, it was the guys replaced them with plastic pronto because, those are expensive to replace.
Okay. So portaloos, brass fittings, anything that can be taken. We did a podcast on post-floods and talking about initially people are incredibly generous and then the shift to entitlement. And so it's really interesting how you see the best and worst of people's nature in this. And so here's a lot of good stuff that's attempting to happen to help as many people as possible. But then after a couple of days, after a couple of weeks, boredom sets in, opportunities, sets in.
Yep.
And so people are stealing brass fittings, which will then stop people from actually having access to water.
Yeah.
And yes.
Yeah.
Okay. You were also, though, testing the quality of the water, and you'd increase the amount of chlorine just in case. But from an environmental health point of view, the water actually remained safe to drink.
As in the wash-up reports at the end of the whole thing, we didn't have any waterborne or foodborne illness reports. And that was a huge deal in the sense that from our perspective in running the environmental health sector and the centre and asking inquiries and trying to work out what was going on, that was always the big question. We didn't know if the pipework had been broken and we had cross-contamination with sewers or commercial waste or chemical waste or anything else. So we got as I understand, very few complaints about off tastes in water or tainted water. We didn't have any waterborne illness outdates. We had very few positive results for any bacterial contamination in water supplies that we knew were still running. So some of the reservoirs and things had a few issues, but they didn't get any. The reservoir could be shut down and basically superdose chlorine and all the rest of it. So there was a few of those done as precaution because they had positive bacterial results in the past, not necessarily due to the earthquake, just because they're the sort of thing that a possum can fall in and create a problem. So they were basically treated very quickly to make sure that there was no issues with those. So in that sense, we were actually really lucky. And on the sewer end, as sort of to deal with it, big chunks of pipework just became holding tanks, and you had lots of septic tank guys going around sucking the sewers out so people could use the toilet as normal. It's just that the sewer line in the street was no longer flowing. It was just a big holding tank.
So you basically just had sewer tanks buried under the ground, under the streets, called pipes, and going around and just sucking that out. Yeah.
Yeah, and that went on for quite a while.
Yeah. It makes sense, though, in terms of the freshwater versus sewage, because if you get any damage to freshwater, it's under pressure. It can only go outwards. You're not going to be tending to get stuff back in. So as long as the source is clean, if you're turning the tap on and it's under pressure, logically it should be clean. Sewage,
logically,
isn't under pressure, and you can flush the toilet and it will go. But like you said, only so many times, and then it's going to be coming back at you.
Yeah.
And so sewage definitely the big problem. So last week you were talking about a person who was giving away water and then started to sell water. What was going on there?
Christchurch has basically a natural aquifer system, and this was a known aquifer. It's always been there, and it was associated with a day spa. And it was basically just untreated water coming up from the ground, wasn't reticulated, and it had a particular wellhead. And after the earthquake, basically that was still running. And he just offered people to come, look, if you want fresh water, he actually did get it independently tested, so we knew it was potable. And so people would go and just collect water. But when people were starting to come to him and collect with a trailer, and a huge tank on the trailer and collecting 400 litres at a time, he started to get a bit worried about the amount of people and aggro that was beginning to happen, because someone who only wanted to fill a 20-litre bottle, all of a sudden they've got a guy in front of them with a 400-litre tank on a trailer, and it started to get a bit that way. And so he started to charge basically a nominal fee to try to reduce a bit of that effort. And ultimately, months afterwards, he registered officially with the Ministry of, would have been Food Safety at the time, since changed its name, to be actually a water bottler. Although he didn't bottle the water, he just provided it, but it was the best.
Because that's just a really interesting one in terms of he started off literally as a charity, just giving away water that he's got in his backyard, effectively. But then he starts selling, and so then he's nudging over the line from looking after your mates to, wait a minute, this is now a business. And so then what are the requirements for business? But wait a minute, he's doing it because he's still trying to be helpful. He didn't do it to make a quid in the first place. He's trying to stop abuse. And so you're here trying to say, well, what are the regulations that apply to you? But he's fundamentally doing a really, really good thing.
Yeah, and basically we were relatively supportive. We walked him, like any of the food businesses at the time, we walked him through everything that he needed to do and worry about. And essentially he worked out that he could meet all of those, and away he went. But it was more about the businesses driving in from town with tanks of water and filling up and disappearing again. And he just began to think that, well, essentially my good nature's being taken advantage of here.
Yes. Let's actually move on to the zombie moment. So as we're talking about everything we've been talking about, we're not talking about the CBD anymore because the CBD just shut down. And we're talking about what was happening out in the suburbs and how the city as a whole survived. What happened in the CBD initially the weeks after the earthquake?
Essentially, it was shut down pretty quickly because of safety issues. So essentially a cordon went around, thrown out around the city and basically manned by the army, which was always fun because, well, we, particularly in the early stages, we went in and out of the city to our secure points, and the army were sitting on the edge of that. So you just had to wave your ID and say, I'm council person with this, and I'm coming through, and they'd check you through, and it always happening, going back and forth. Eventually, there were some natural points that you could secure. So around the Avon River and things like that, you could create as a border, and the other areas were streets were fenced off. And basically, it was to prevent anyone other than contractors, civil defense, demolition, all of that from going into the central city. And so it was basically initially a safety thing because of all of the buildings that were a problem. At any stage, a number of them could fall down, and so it was to keep people safe. Ostensibly, it was to prevent any looting as well.
Given that people are stealing portaloos and brass, I could not imagine looting being an issue at all.
Yeah, it's surprising. There were definitely homeless people that were living in the CBD who probably didn't leave.
Okay.
And so they were tromping around in there. We know really quickly, the Civil Defence Centre where I ended up working quite a lot of the time, I was sitting with the Army. And the Army were paying a lot of attention to what was happening in the CBD, and we're pretty sure that they were field testing quite a lot of movement sensors and night vision stuff and sensors just on the security of the CBD. So if anything moved, they knew about it. So we weren't too worried about that. We actually think that looting, as you might think of as, grabbing money and things like that, that probably all happened, any that did happen, pretty much on the same day as the earthquake or very quickly afterwards. There's some weird things that happened. One group of hospitality outlets that we dealt with later on, there were 4 tills very close together. The one till was missing, the cash drawer was missing. The other 3 were still there. So
Okay.
the owner recovered about 20K in cash and reckoned that the missing one probably had 5 or 6K in it.
Yes.
But it's sort of if someone had come in to loot the place, you would have expected them to have got all 4. And so there was always that question of, well, someone must have grabbed that pretty much on the day of the earthquake and taken off and didn't come back.
Yes, because if you're going to come back, we'll
Where
grab
the others are.
all the cash rather than just, I'll put this under my arm and I'll just keep on going.
Yeah.
Would have made fascinating viewing of watching people walking out of the CBD, till underarm or whatever, but yes.
At the time, no one was really paying attention to that. There was so many ways out of the CBD that people just scattered and collected up later. Yeah, from our point of view, you could never search everyone. Later on with the demolition and things like this, there were a lot of issues that the police got. We actually had the police going into the red zone during demolitions to deal with issues.
Yeah. You're talking about, these places were now just effectively just shut down. Buildings were dropped on top of them. Like, it's just a big, massive insurance claim. And so having some small things disappear here or there, a till here or there, in the grand scheme of things, not the end of the world. But the risk to life trying to have this entire CBD just shut down. For anyone who's never been to Christchurch, the CBD is a beautiful grid, and then it's got a nice couple ring roads all the way around from which, chaos then radiates out. But you're talking about, it's about 6 blocks wide, and then probably about 10 blocks long.
Yeah.
And that entire area was just shut down. Big fence all the way around. I would make a joke about a certain country at this stage, but I'm still planning on visiting. So, but it's that sort of like, let's just.
Yep.
Okay. So no one's coming in or out apart from demolition people or whatever. So what's the concern? So we're now talking weeks later. What's the issue?
So where we got tied up into this is, for whatever reason, and these things always in hindsight, you look at it and go even more, what was the reason? There was this overwhelming concern from various groups of civil defence that all of this food in the CBD, because there's lots of food businesses, was going to feed rats, and we're going to have a rodent explosion, which would create health problems and would be unsafe for people to work in there because of the risk of disease in rats. And anyway, we ended up running a user pays contract, of all things, to go in with an engineer, and small business owners could get support from civil defence. We would go in, we would have paid cleaners. So this is why it was user pays. And we would go into your business and clean up all the food waste and leave it as clean as we could. And you could recover small items like your till or personal items that had been left at the time of the earthquake. So lots of people had things like, particularly family-owned businesses, they had things that were important to the family still in the shop, paintings or decorative items or bits of equipment or knives. For a chef, their knives are everything. All of those things. So we were taking part in those, but they couldn't take out equipment. They couldn't recover an oven. They couldn't recover a fridge or anything like that. And we had to have an engineer clear a route for us to go in, so it was safe to go in, clear and safe enough for us to continue work in the building. And we were given time slots, so we could only go in after a certain time. We had to be out by a certain time. And we often had spotters in the street watching buildings, because if there was an aftershock, you needed to know where everyone could go to. So we had a bit of a safety briefing before we went in. And that's all well and good, apart from we only were able to deal with about a third of the businesses that were safe to get into. The other 2/3 were in buildings that were completely unsafe. There's no way that you were going to send anyone in, voluntary or owner or anyone, because they were too high a risk for anyone to go in for any great length of time. So to reduce the amount of food for rats, we were at best only taking a third out. And during the third that we did, we only ever ran into about 3 or 4 places where we could actually say there were rats or something there.
Yeah. So in terms of justification, if you shut a place down, if you do get rats coming in, there's still only a finite amount of food there. So yes, the rats can have a field day, but that food source is going to run out.
Yep. And the thousands of people that worked in the CBD and the daily waste and everything else that was produced in the normally running city area was way more supportive of rats than there's nothing more coming in. When this runs out, we're going to starve.
So the
rats.
bins would have been a bigger rat risk than having, especially if you're talking about having a cold room. So you've got a sealed door. Yes, open it up, it's going to stink, but the rats aren't coming and going. But the moment they've used it and they've tossed it out into the bin, it's now just sitting there.
Yeah. So, but we had to do this waste cleanup. We actually had a small rubbish truck with us. So we would go in and everything would go into the rubbish truck. And so it was an in-out, clean it stuff. We occasionally had really hideous things that we found that, there was no way we could have done anything else. But at the time, it was just really, really repulsive.
And what was the worst?
worst for smell is anything that's fish. So if
Yes.
you're cleaning out a freezer that's got 20 odd kilos of fish in it, it's the only time the cleaners actually really wore the masks was when dealing with lots of rotten fish. The one that
Are we talking
had
about
us
just
all in,
flimsy COVID masks, or are we talking about going hazmat?
oh no, we had hazmat masks for those.
Yes.
And the one that, as I say, caused us terrific entertainment, and we know that it didn't get to the river. So it was a good thing that the sewer and stormwater lines were broken, which they definitely were in the central city. We cleaned a place out it was a bar, and they had probably 40, 50 3-4 litre containers of things like orange juice and milk. So the giant bulk catering containers.
Yes.
And they'd been unrefrigerated for about 8-9 weeks at the time that we found them. So they were all basically swollen round, do not open because these are on the edge of bursting.
Yes.
And we put them into our rubbish truck, and it was a compactor truck. So when they compacted it, all of the stuff exploded. And it just poured over the tailgate of, your classic rubber truck, filled it up to the top like a pond, and then poured over the top and disappeared down one of the stormwater grates, but congealed lumps of white milk. And it was, someone described it as, that an elephant had vomited in the street when this truck started to move off. But there was no other way for us to deal with this stuff. And we were very much on the, oh no, this is going to end up on the river. This is going to be a problem. And so we set a couple of guys off to watch any of the stormwater exits onto the river to see if we needed to sandbag them to stop the stuff from getting out. And it never appeared. We don't know where it went. The remediation of the area never found it. So as far as we can tell, it just basically soaked into the sand somewhere under the CBD.
There's a rat nightclub underground just serving non-stop yogurt for the next 100 years.
Yeah.
So,
but it was really interesting to see.
Yes. Okay. So non-stop yogurt. What about meat? Did you go into freezers and suddenly just?
Yeah, that a lot of the products even then were vacuum packed. So basically, it was vacuum packed. It was just straight out. A surprising amount of the food that we were able to deal with was already packaged. So in a lot of ways, it was just making sure that none of the packages were broken and you could get rid of it reasonably quickly. Yeah, sometimes it wasn't, and it became, just a real stink. There were a couple of chest freezers that we weren't going to clean out. There'd been no power for a while. Everything had things had liquefied. So there were things floating in things.
Wow.
And one of the best ways to deal with that was we would just record the details of which premises and which freezer it was, and then we'd just duct tape it shut.
Yes.
And leave it, because it was never going to be recovered.
Biohazardous waste.
Yeah.
From a garbage disposal point of view, then, you're taking stuff away that is well and truly beyond normal sort of waste. Could you just dump it as per normal, or were there special requirements?
No, that waste, the food waste, could just go in the normal landfill. So it just went to the transfer stations and went out to Cape Valley, our landfill operating at the time, as per normal. Demolition waste, there were at least three options for it. One of it was just to be left where it was as it fell. The other was that it would be, because it was contaminated with all sorts of things you couldn't use as a clean fill, that would go to a landfill site at Burwood, which was reopened or kept open for that purpose. You couldn't use it to do anything with, because it's got metals and potentially food and furniture and everything else in it. And the third one, which was much more carefully handled and always had to be, was anywhere where there had been fatalities, and all of that waste was moved very carefully, very respectfully, to a location and that waste was gone through very carefully to make sure that there was nothing that needed to be found and dealt with.
Yes. How many people died in the earthquake?
Now you've got me. It should be etched in my head, but no. The CTV building was probably the one that was the standout, and that's the one that most of the waste was sorted through very carefully. Oh, no, I'm not even going to guess because I'll either underestimate it. It's just something that we know. There's the memorial wall and things like this, and people we knew were killed. So it's at this point, I just know that they did and where.
And it really, the key difference between the first and the second was the first, was upsetting, but the second one was tragic.
Yeah, the first one, way more movement, lots of liquefaction. It was spectacular for the liquefaction in areas. And we had lots of building guys come down from up and down the country and even from overseas eventually to look at the damage that had been done to buildings and the liquefaction and taking measurements and being really, really interested in it. Second one, short, sharp hammer, not as long, not as much liquefaction, but lots more shock damage to the buildings. That's the one that did all of the really major damage, particularly the CBD buildings.
I had the opportunity of then going through the CBD on one of the bus tours just before they opened it up again. And it really did just seem like a zombie movie in that you could just see, like go past restaurants, you could still see stuff just sitting on the tables where people had just literally got up, walked out, left all that food behind. You're now stepping into behind the scenes and cleaning up a lot of the restaurants, but just absolutely everywhere was just food scraps, human existence up and gone.
Yep.
But you didn't see at that stage the rat infestation that the fear was.
No. With all the broken windows and things, we actually had more issues with birds because the birds would fly through the broken window. And as you say, there's lots of food left on counters and things like that, and the birds would get to it. So that was the biggest animal that we had an issue with. The other one was just flies, just normal flies infesting food. So to look in some of those buildings, you could see what people thought were carpets of rat crap, because there's thousands and thousands of these black cylindrical objects about 5 millimeters long, and they were actually fly pupa cases.
Yes.
So if you were looking at a chiller, for example, that the door had broken, it would be filled with these black cases, and people would say, "Oh, must have been thousands of rats," and it's like, no, it's fly pupa cases, and you've had the classic maggots in the meat, and now everything's gone, and you're left with these.
So the soldiers hanging around, did they notice flies? Population further around, were they complaining about flies?
No, they didn't complain about flies. They didn't complain about rats. They did tell us occasionally that there were very big rats, and basically that was the extent of their discussion, was that we occasionally see really big ones.
Healthy rats.
They were much more interested in homeless people that were still drifting around in there.
Yeah. Okay, so from an environmental health risk point of view, actually having a city shut down isn't a huge risk in terms of impacting what's around it. So you didn't see this mass explosion of rats spreading out. You didn't see a mass explosion of flies spreading out. But you also then had the city didn't get repopulated again for years.
Yep.
So the story that we're telling now could have had a totally different ending if everyone was walking back in 3 months later, but that wasn't the case.
Yeah. The real difference from looking out from an earthquake is that if you've got a place that's flooded, your damage to the buildings is much less. So you could go into a flooded building, for the sake of argument, cut out all the wall linings, dry it out, replace the carpets, repaint it, do everything you need to do, and then reoccupy it. In the buildings that we were dealing with, you were being told not to go into them because the engineers were pointing out that the thing could slide off in any one of 4 directions.
Yes.
It could fall over at any time. And within 6 or 8 months, it wouldn't be there anymore. So starting new meant absolutely new. You had to rebuild the whole building or put something there that you could use.
And so we've joked about Christchurch having the most shipping containers in the world, but the most portaloos in the world. But it got to the stage where Christchurch had the most car parks in the world, because it got to the stage where it felt like every second or third building was literally just demolished straight down to the ground, and you just had a vacant block. So what percentage of the buildings were destroyed in the end?
Oh,
Well, I'm getting you with all the stats. You can go, I'll plead the fifth.
wouldn't know. It was pretty significant. There isn't very much for me to walk through the central city now. There's not very much that pre-existed the earthquake. For the CBD in particular, it was really much on the highs. It would over 60%, I think, actually went down in the end.
Yes.
But it's a combination. Most of the older buildings went.
Yes.
Anything newer survived.
Yes.
So that the City Council building survived. The IRD building survived. A couple of the big hotels survived, and a number of the newer shops and supporting administrative and office buildings survived. It was a bit of a lottery. The City Council building was ex-post office and sorting office and was overbuilt to start with.
Yes.
So that's why it survived, as far as we can tell. It was over 100% of construction. One of the hotels, which is only just now being refitted, it's been empty ever since. And they finally sorted out the insurance issues and they're now rebuilding. That was way over 100% of the building code at the time because it was built as a possible private hospital. So it was built to a resilience hospital standard. And so you had buildings like that. And even some of the buildings that survived, one of the hotels, for example, that's now a hotel, was an office block. Essentially, the building itself survived. All the internal staircases disappeared. So they all had to be
Okay. I also saw every single church in the place was destroyed. And to the point where the controversial bit is what happens to the cathedral, slap bang in the middle of Christchurch. That one, last time I was there, still is
under construction.
A safer version than what it was just after the earthquake, but not much different.
Yeah.
But pretty much all of those 100-plus-year-old buildings, the big ones, now just gone.
Yep.
And
the Art Centre survived, and they probably one of the few buildings that had significant insurance enough to do substantial rebuilding. Even so, they've run out of money. One of the first council administrative buildings, what was Canterbury Council, one of the first buildings that housed the local administration, still hasn't progressed. It was roofed over to prevent any water getting into it because the top of it collapsed in on the bottom. It's been roofed over to prevent any further damage, but there's no money to restore it. So it's sitting waiting for sufficient funds to come together to restore it.
So looping back to the environmental health aspect of it then, so you're stepping in to try and get rid of a rat infestation, trying to potentially, just reduce the health risk. In hindsight, you can now see that it wasn't until years later that people were stepping back in to reoccupy. What would you now recommend? Best course of action?
Best course of action would have been basically to essentially prepare a waste site. And that was always going to be mixed waste. So there was no way that you were ever going to go in and clear all of those buildings of everything else that's in them. So all the furniture and electronics and everything else that would be in an office building or a hotel or anything else was all going to be there when you demolished it. It would be much more of, look, just find a suitable site that you can transport all of this stuff to, because you can't use it as fill, you can't build on it. It's just got to go somewhere and be managed as waste that you can't deal with, or at the very best, you're going to have to take it somewhere where someone with a lot of patience is going to sort through it and try to recover all the metals and everything else for recycling. But essentially, you just got to move it to somewhere else.
Yes. And I said in the intro, psychologically, that was the difference between the first earthquake and the second. First earthquake was that hope of let's quickly rebuild. And the second one was cutting losses.
Yeah, the first one was most of the damage basically went round the other way. Most of the damage for the residential red zone was in the first earthquake. All the liquefaction and pipes and everything else. So it was away from the CBD that most of the damage and personal upset and loss of, you lost your house and all the rest of it, that all happened out there. The second one, it was the CBD that took the biggest hit.
Yes.
The other thing I would say about what we would do differently is we wouldn't try to get rid of the waste, but that the whole process of getting people engineering support to go in and recover things from their buildings was a good one, because people did at least get a few things, not necessarily money, but it's the things that they've felt they'd left behind. I mean, a number of them had left wallets and handbags and all their personal stuff behind. They had just left. So going in and recovering those, definitely, I would support. But going into clean waste, no.
Yeah, because the argument was health risk. And so the irony was that you were literally taking cleaners paid to go in and clean something to remove a risk, but in the process, you're putting them at risk.
Yeah.
And so in hindsight, that other risk didn't exist. So why put people in that risk at the first place?
Why put people at risk? Yeah. We could have dealt with much smaller groups and been much quicker. I mean, some of the places that ended up not being engineeringly safe to go in and clean the waste out of, they were still able to later get people in and give them essentially like a 20-minute window. They'd get a vehicle in there, they would have 20 minutes to get in to the building. There were lots of spotters and engineers and everyone else around, and they would go in and grab stuff. In one particular building, the engineers, even the owners, weren't allowed to go in. They set up with some light rescue people, and basically the owners described what they were after and where it was in the building, because the building was, bordering on it was very unsafe. And so they had to describe everything to these guys, and they went in basically full safety gear and everything, and basically ran in, grabbed what they had been described and ran out again.
Yes. Yeah, and you don't want to slam the door on the way out, because that'll be the last door you ever slam.
No, and that particular building had shifted it was broken off at ground level and had moved. So it was now off-center.
Yes.
It was like, that's not a good one to be in. So.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So what's really interesting about this story is we've now gone, hey, look at this role of an EHO, keep people's lives safe and do all this sort of stuff. And then we get to the end of this awesome story and going, but in hindsight, it would have been good if we had basically just done nothing and instead focused on other issues.
I think the biggest point to focus on in the end was the recovery. And at the far end, you talked about demolition waste, and we've talked about demolition waste. All the things like asbestos and all the rest of it that was in that. It was, well, what are you going to do when these buildings come down? They're likely, you're going to have to deal with that. Where does it go? How do you deal with it? How do you manage that? And expectations from noise and dust and everything else. Some of these temporary dump sites that we used or in the sense that temporary time limited, because time went, you could say long, particularly the demolition and building guys became really used to it because, well, it's cheaper, closer and faster than going all the way out to the designated landfill. So why can't we just keep this open?
Yes.
And so they were agitating really hard. And everyone who lived on the roads to and from those sites were, we don't like the traffic, we don't like the noise, we don't like the dust, we don't know what's going to happen with the dust coming off this landfill that you're using. And so from noise, dust hazards and all the rest of it that we deal with on complaints, that was becoming a bigger issue.
Yes. Yes. So in hindsight, identify the risk, but actually quantify the risk and then try and focus on what's going to be the most important. Face it, whatever happened after Christchurch, part of it was strong knee-jerk reactions. Part of it is nothing like this has ever happened before. And so no one can ever be criticized for what happened. But the benefit of hindsight is we can actually now turn around and say, actually, this risk isn't as big as we thought it was. But focusing on this would have been potentially better. And that's why it makes for such a good podcast, because it's about, hey, here's the lessons learned. And so, yeah.
And the thing that happened pretty much, as I say, the CBD disappeared as a place of operation. But we were dealing, particularly, I dealt lots and lots and lots with the food businesses in recovery. You were dealing with lots of people coming up with great ideas to reuse things like containers, small spaces all over the place to recover their food business. So you were doing what you could say the routine food business stuff. But whereas in a normal town, you might get sort of a small percentage of new businesses opening every year. We had 700 open in 18 months to 2 years. So you were almost always dealing with people with new businesses, lots who'd never done it before, or opportunity was still there. So you were busy from that perspective. But the CBD, until they started to rebuild the stuff in there, you didn't have it.
Zombieland. So, yeah, that's probably a really, really good place to finish this episode. So, Stephen, thank you very, very much for sharing the highs and lows, the smells and the joys of a CBD turned into a zombie zone. And I suspect that we'll have an episode coming up soon on how to open 700 restaurants in the space of a couple months. Yes. So thank you very much, Stephen, for being on EHO Knows.